There was a time, just over a year ago, when the awareness of an individual was suspended under general anesthetic. One moment, a sense of detachment and a coldness emerged, and then came oblivion. In that blacked out interim, there was not even an inkling of time passing, no internal sense of waiting, no recollection of events. When consciousness returned, it was clear that there had been a complete absence, rather than just the hazy sleep of an ordinary night. That deep and total interruption can raise central questions. How exactly does experience of any kind arise? How do we get from a living, breathing body, composed of cells, tissues, and electrical impulses, to vivid moments of subjective perception? Some people highlight that the transition from a thinking, feeling person to a state of oblivion under anesthetic and back again reflects the fragile relationship between the physical processes in the body and the intangible phenomenon of consciousness. Life's major philosophical and scientific question is how these fleeting experiences are generated. Matter, with its structures and forces, might appear purely mechanical from one viewpoint, but somehow, in certain arrangements, the phenomenon of conscious awareness appears. A large puzzle has always been whether the sense of being here is entirely dependent on complicated brain signals, or whether consciousness is more than neural machinery. For centuries, individuals have tried to explain how intangible experiences, colors, sounds, emotions, even a sense of self, could emerge from physical matter. The scenario of the operating room, where a person simply vanishes from their own point of view until the drugs wear off, underscores the disconnection that can happen between neural activity and one's sense of existing in time. Even the simple act of waking from deep sleep typically includes a sense that a certain number of hours have passed, but in anesthesia, time disappears so completely that the gap might have been an eternity or just a moment. This underscores how intangible, yet pivotal, conscious awareness can be. Many lines of research propose that consciousness is intimately tied to the functioning of billions of neurons, each a complex cell passing signals across synapses. The combined result is not a random explosion of impulses, but an intricate pattern that yields experiences of color, taste, and even a sense of personal identity. The question remains, how does all that activity become felt experience, rather than just being mechanical? Some people see parallels to the older problem of explaining life. It was once believed that life could not be derived solely from physics and chemistry. Yet, over time, biologists have parsed out metabolism, heredity, and homeostasis in physical terms. By analogy, they hope an explanation for consciousness might emerge from further research once the right perspective is found. Still, the notion that physical processes alone suffice can be perplexing. For instance, illusions demonstrate that perception is not simply a reading of external data. The brain is not an empty vessel receiving accurate images. It actively constructs an interpretation of incoming signals. Classic illusions, like the example where two patches of the same shade of gray appear to differ, depending on context, prove that the mind is a predictive machine. Through such illusions, one sees that the visual system integrates prior expectations about shadows and brightness, so the final experience can deviate significantly from the raw input. In typical everyday circumstances, these predictions align with reality well enough to navigate the world successfully. But illusions highlight that what appears as a direct window to reality is at least partly shaped by internal assumptions. A further auditory example reveals how new predictions from the brain can reshape experience in an instant. A clip of distorted speech might seem incomprehensible until one hears a clearer version of the same phrase. Then, replaying the original reveals that one suddenly hears words within the noise. This shift in perception occurs without any change to the external sound. Only the mind's expectations have changed. Instantly, the meaning pops out in what was once unintelligible. This underscores that the brain's predictions and beliefs actively mold the content of perception. The mind is never merely a camera passively recording. It's more akin to a guesswork system that updates its best guesses based on context. Some people also assert that hallucinations are like free-form or uncontrolled versions of this normal predictive process. In psychosis or certain induced states, the mind's predictions might become so strong and so uncorrected by actual sensory data that it generates elaborate visions or false beliefs. Even in normal perception, we are always generating a kind of controlled hallucination, with the difference being that stable sensory inputs keep illusions within a socially agreed upon range. The consensus view of color, shape, or space is effectively a shared hallucination validated by similar brains receiving similar cues. This suggests that perception is more about the brain's expectations guided by signals than about direct access to objective facts. Yet these illusions and constructs do not only characterize the external world, they also define the experience of being oneself. Intuitively, it seems as if each person is a stable entity with a firm boundary, anchored in a particular vantage. But many experiments indicate that the sense of personal identity and body ownership is similarly constructed. One well-known demonstration is the rubber hand illusion. A rubber hand is placed on a table while the real hand is concealed out of sight. Both hands are stroked with a brush simultaneously. Over time, many people feel as though the rubber hand is actually theirs, as if the sense of body ownership has migrated. That the mind can recategorize an inanimate object as part of one's body simply through synchronized touches highlights how body representation is fluid and open to suggestion. Going deeper, the sense of a body from the inside, monitoring states like heartbeat, respiration, tension, or gut feelings, also shapes the sense of self. The interplay of internal signals, known as interoception, is not about perceiving the body as an external object, but about controlling and regulating essential processes. These signals tell the organism about blood pressure, hunger, or the need to adjust various parameters for survival. This aspect of consciousness, distinct from external vision or hearing, is tied to the body's interior. The brain receives these internal signals, but rather than forming a crisp image of the inside, it integrates them in a regulatory cycle. Biological requirements like maintaining heart rate or body temperature reveal that aspects of self-perception are not about discovering facts, but about driving homeostasis. That leads to the idea that the brain's top-down predictions do not only guess the external environment, but also manage internal states. Consciousness, from this perspective, is not limited to picking out shapes and colors in the external world. It also orchestrates a sense of self that is consistent with the body's needs. If illusions about the external environment are normal, illusions about the sense of self might be normal too. The difference is that illusions about self can have intense emotional or psychological consequences. Some conditions, for example, involve distorted bodily self-perception or extreme doubt about personal existence, indicating that the sense of I is malleable. An interesting result of these observations is the notion that we do not see the world as it is, we see it as we predict it to be. This same logic might be applied to the self. We do not experience ourselves directly as we are in some objective sense. We experience ourselves according to how the brain predicts us to be. The feeling of identity is thus another controlled hallucination, though typically a stable one. Freed from the illusions of real-time bodily continuity as in an anesthesia, a person can vanish entirely. There is no sense of self or of time passing. When consciousness reemerges, it rebuilds the sense of presence and continuity. There is also a pragmatic dimension. Some say this perspective helps unravel deep questions about mental health. If both world perception and self-perception are built through predictions, then disruptions or imbalances in the predictive process may yield conditions like depression, anxiety, or psychosis. Instead of describing them as purely biochemical imbalances, one can investigate them as shifts in how internal or external illusions are regulated. For instance, a depressed individual might have negative predictive expectations that lead them to interpret ambiguous experiences in defeatist ways, reinforcing a cycle. Understanding the predictive architecture might let researchers find new methods to tweak these illusions or moderate them in beneficial ways. Additionally, the perspective that advanced computing devices might spontaneously become conscious is tempered once one realizes how much consciousness ties into an embodied system regulating an organism's survival. A machine that simply becomes very good at data processing does not replicate the living biology underlying experiences of hunger, thirst, or vulnerability. Computers can model patterns, but that is not the same as feeling them from the inside, a feeling intimately tied to maintaining bodily integrity. This line of reasoning suggests that no matter how much raw computational power emerges, consciousness might still require a close connection to an organism's internal regulation. Some people remain open to the possibility that new forms of artificial life could replicate this, but it would presumably require more than raw intelligence. Toward the end of this exploration, a consistent theme arises. Illusions aren't ephemeral mistakes, but fundamental to how life and experience operate. This is not necessarily a negative revelation. Illusions can be adaptive. The illusions of space and color guide daily navigation. Illusions of personal identity anchor relationships and responsibilities. Illusions of consistent time progression let one plan. Understanding illusions reveals the brain's brilliance, weaving raw signals and prior knowledge into a workable reality. The notion that illusions can sometimes fail or become unhelpful suggests a dynamic interplay. Illusions must be stabilized by consistent evidence and by communal verification. When illusions are shared, we call them reality. Furthermore, the fragility or fluidity of illusions opens a window to deeper wonder about what truly transpires when consciousness ceases, like under general anesthesia, and restarts. It also fosters humility. Daily experience feels so stable and real that it's easy to forget how dependent it is on the complex interplay of neural predictions. The ephemeral nature of existence might lead one to appreciate each moment more. If the sense of self is effectively constructed in real time, it might encourage one to see personal identity not as a rigid monolith, but as a process that can be refined or reevaluated. This can have ethical and psychological implications, such as in learning to be kinder to oneself or more open to transformation. Additionally, the direction of new research might involve bridging neural predictive models with the subjective descriptions from introspective traditions. Some people, including those from traditions worldwide, have long studied how to calm or expand the sense of self through meditation, breathing practices, or other methods. The synergy between scientific knowledge about illusions and time-tested introspective methods might yield deeper insights. Perhaps new frameworks in neurophenomenology will systematically correlate changes in subjective experience with modifications in predicted signals or bodily states. This might point to ways to intentionally shift or lighten illusions that cause distress, or to cultivate illusions that promote well-being. Finally, acknowledging illusions can quell fear about the final cessation of consciousness. If consciousness arises through this ephemeral interplay of predictions, then the end of life is simply an end to that interplay. For some, this perspective is less daunting than a black and white division between an immortal soul and oblivion. It fosters an attitude that, just as illusions gently shape living experience, their cessation is also a natural transition, akin to how deep anesthesia is a total unawareness. In the meantime, one's conscious life is an opportunity to engage with illusions skillfully, shaping them in ways that foster both personal and collective flourishing. Thus, from the vantage of an individual returning from anesthesia to daily life, to illusions of color, shape, and self, to the recognition that we are always constructing a reality and a sense of who we are, each thread points to an extraordinary phenomenon. Consciousness is contingent, constructed, and yet unbelievably vital. Illusions can be anchors for purposeful living rather than mere deceptions to outgrow. And as we see consciousness as dependent on biological processes, we also become aware of the many ways that mindful living, ethical relationships, and careful stewardship of well-being, both individually and collectively, can feed back into the illusions we cultivate. The interplay of illusions, bodies, and environment, while delicate, forms the basis of all that we cherish in lived experience.